a beautiful Sunday morning with brilliant sunshine and the voices coming over the radio saying that we were at war. And everybody, the whole world seemed to stop. It was, although half expected, it was dreaded. Something that you dread above all had happened. And we didn't really know what to expect, none of us. But we were very afraid, really, deep down. Well, to start off with, because we'd heard of air raid, speaking personally, I thought that the next day that we would be having airplanes coming over and all the things we'd seen on the cinema, and we had the air raid siren went the next day, and I bundled my grandfather down, because we were living with him. I bundled him downstairs into the cellar, got him out of bed, bundled him downstairs into the cellar, and we all sat there for ages, absolutely nothing. So when he went back up to bed, I was told never, ever to get him out of bed again, that he would rather die comfortably than be stuck in the cellar. And that's the last time the cellar was ever used as an air raid shelter. So that was the start off. And then it calmed down. And then, of course, for quite some time, nothing seemed to happen. Everybody was holding their breath. Nothing seemed to happen. And then, of course, Germany, just started then, and all the boys went over and were going to fight, and there was sadness and joy. But we never anticipated 1942, when we were so badly beaten and Dunkirk happened. We couldn't believe that. And that's the first time, I think, as a nation, we were really scared, because it's the only time I heard talk of what we should do if they arrived. What we could do to defend ourselves, should the Germans arrive. Before that, there'd never been a thought of them arriving. My peer group were all going in the forces, volunteering if they wanted to go into the force that they chose, or if they waited to be called up, then they were pushed wherever they were needed. So quite a lot of them chose to join the RAF, strangely enough. So we realised that girls then were being called up as well as the boys. So we thought seriously of what we should do. And she and my friend Doreen Denton, whom I'd worked with from being a schoolgirl, decided that nursing was what we really needed. We were both members of St John's Ambulance, so we thought we would carry on. But we found out that we'd have to work 12 weeks without pay, and the family, my mother was a widow, and there were three of us, and I was the eldest, so my wages were helping to support the family. So there was no way that I could be subsidised by them. So nursing was supposed to be not on for us. When we heard that Armstrong Whitworth were recruiting for work in the aircraft factory, and we were told that we could have up to £5 a week wage, which was a fortune, far more than we could ever earn in the valley. She and I went and got some forms. Doreen and I went and got some forms, took them home to be filled in. We thought all our problems were solved. My mother sat down and talked to me and said, "I hope you've thought it through." And she signed. But Doreen's mother, because her brother had just gone in the forces, refused to sign. So I had a decision to make. And so I decided that either out of lunacy or out of adventure, that I would go alone. So 1942 January, early January, I caught the train by myself. And as I say, if you'd been in the forces, you would meet up with a group of like people. But because I was going on my own, I knew no one. And I arrived in Coventry station, and of course it was blitzed. It was absolute piles of rubble, just tarpaulin to walk along. And the van was waiting outside in the blackout for us all. By this, a group of people got together, and they were the ones that had also volunteered to go. And the van went round and round the streets. Of course, it had to go a long way round because a lot of the streets were impassable anyway. So they were dropping people off at houses, 2 here, there, 1 there, 3 there. And myself and another girl were the last 2 in the van. And she and I were dropped off right at the other end of Coventry, a place called Wyken. And we were left at this house. So you can imagine me not knowing anybody, walking into a house not knowing anywhere with a girl that I didn't know. It was quite an experience. It was. When we got to the station, got out of the train, it was the station. There wasn't a station as such. It was just a collection of duck boards, walking boards, covered in tarpaulin. And when we didn't know what to expect. And when we went, we couldn't see in the van. It was darkened, you know. So I didn't see Coventry until the following weekend when I went into town. But we knew that because they kept having to reverse in roads, we knew that there must be some problem there. But we had no idea. We hadn't got it. We'd seen pictures on the film and we'd felt for them. You know, we realised how horrendous it was being. But until you've seen it with your own eyes, you can't visualise. Even pictures, you can't visualise it. Not only that, it was the smell of dust. And I can't describe it. Almost a musty smell somehow. To me, it seemed so. And it was quite a shock. After Calderdale, who had never had nothing. So it was quite a shock. You're eager to start on this adventure, you know, but when we went to work at the factory and I saw the size of the factory and how little and insignificant we were, and the fact that the men in the factory were not exactly delighted to see us, because for every girl that went, one man was allowed to go in the forces. Yes, they didn't think we were needed. Do you know what I mean? They almost resented girls being in there. So we went to a meeting with Mrs. Wilkie-Smith, who was in charge of the girls. She was a welfare officer. As I said, she was dressed in her Pringles sweater and pearls and an immaculate hairdo, telling us, you know, we were doing our bit for the war and how to behave and what to expect and this sort of business. We were all given green wraparound overalls and then dispersed around the factory. So imagine a girl on her own walking into a gang of workmen who looked at you as if to say, what the heck are you doing here, you know? So you stood there like a spare dinner for a while, and then in a bit someone gave me a most awful job because it was on the Whitley and they were just finishing that. So therefore the whole thing was running down. So they had some screws that were too long. So I was given the job of sewing about 1/2 inch off the end of these screws, putting it in a vise, and with a die redoing the thread. So I had to stand at the bench hour after hour doing this, and even it was the most horrendous job. So did I regret leaving home? I most certainly did. I'd have crawled home if I could have come home. And when I asked if I could go home for the weekend because I was so upset, I was told in no uncertain terms, no. And in those days, you did as you were told. You did not argue. So I did get home. And I went into Coventry. I was out in the outskirts of Coventry. I made my way into town. Mind you, I'd lived in Sowerby Bridge, where it's a close community of people, where I knew almost everybody and then met on the street. I walked up to the top of this town that was all in rubbles, all in pieces. Trinity Church stood there, as it still stands, in its glory. The cathedral had gone, but Trinity Church was there. And I stood outside there and I watched people go by, and there was not one face that I knew. And so I think for the first time in my life, I knew what loneliness meant. And it's not walking on a moor by yourself. It's standing in a crowd of people and feeling utterly alone, with not one familiar face. And there, I must admit, there was a few tears, but it didn't matter. Nobody was there to see them anyway. So, you know, that was, yes, I did regret it. The first 3 months, I don't know how I stood it, really. I don't. I stayed at a place in Diggs with the married man and his wife and 2 children. And that was difficult because when one came home from work, we had our supper or meal. Flo, the other girl, of course, was dressed up in her glad rags and was off out. I went upstairs and I did the ironing for sometimes. If you go to sit in a chair, you're not sure if it's somebody's chair. So I spent a great deal of my time upstairs in my room reading books. I love reading anyway, and writing letters. I could have been Mrs. Basildon Bond, I tell you. I spent a lot of time writing letters, just keeping out of the way, really. And so it wasn't, that was lonely too, really. But you had to put up with it. It was everybody else did. I wasn't unique. There was hundreds and hundreds of people doing the same thing, and you just had to hope for the best. Of course, wintertime didn't make it any better either, really, because she was stuck inside. And of course, remember, it was black out, so if you went outside, it was pitch black. You didn't know where you were going. I remember going to the Gaumont in Coventry, and gradually the cinema emptied. And I was sitting there, and then someone came along and said to me, "The buses have stopped running. It's a beautiful moonlight night outside. They're expecting a raid. You better go home," she said. So I came out of the Gaumont. I didn't know how to go home, but I knew the way the bus went. So I walked in the moonlight to the bus depot, and then I followed the bus route all the way back to Wycombe. Afterwards, I could have cut the journey down by half, but I didn't know at the time. And I tell you, I cried all the way, and I never saw a soul. I didn't see a soul in the street. But nobody there to see me, so, you just got over it. The factory was huge. I'd never seen such a big factory in my life. It was consist of the outside was an apron that they flew the planes off, finished from Baggington, and then there were 3 long sheds, assembly sheds, and the old Whitley was finishing, and they were putting up new jigs, and this, we were told, was for the Lancaster aircraft. So me, being about 18 and fed up with the job I had, was persuaded to go on with it. Well, I was told to go on this particularly with the group of people, and I was the gopher. I fetched this and fetched that. And so the foreman, or some of the very clever men, were there with blueprints, and they were gradually learning how to put the wing section I worked on, the monocoque section, the wing section. They were learning how to build this slowly, piece by piece. But another thing that happened, I thought they were all engineers. But I realised I was called a Dilutee. And I realised that some of them couldn't read a blueprint any better than I could. And from then on, I became quite confident. I thought, I'm not as thick as I thought I was in this business. Because being an engineer was rather something. And then, of course, I didn't mention about the union. We had to join a union. It was mandatory. It was a closed shop. And the engineering union, the Allied, was the main union in the factory. So, but they'd had a little meeting, and they decided they would accept girls, but only on a temporary basis. So, of course, I joined. Well, there were no cloakrooms, no places for the girls really to put their things, and we complained about it, but nothing much was done at all, really. We just had to put up with it. Then, as I say, the Lancaster, the jigs were put up, they started in production, then more and more people were needed because it began to be one continuous line where each section depended on the other, of course, to complete before the whole aircraft. It was like Lego almost. Each little section would be completed, and then it was carried off by big cranes to the final assembly where it was all put together, engines put in and flown off. So it was really like a track system. You were on the track system. So, of course, more and more girls were needed. So they had groups of girls from Hinckley who were hosiery workers, who were very nimble-fingered. And when they came to do riveting, which needed fine, dexterous hands, the girls were quite good. In fact, they were quicker than the men. And again, we were paid in a gang system, which was piecework. Then, of course, they were more welcome than I had been when I first went in. So gradually more and more girls came in. Then they were already unionised when they came in, and they were part of the Transport and General Workers Union. So there was some little dispute, wasn't there, between the AEU and the Transport and Generals. It was serious because they didn't agree with the two unions being together. But once they were in, we did get special cloakrooms, and we were allowed to go out 5 minutes to get the bus before the men. So there you are. That was quite good. Generally speaking, they were. I got on very well, really. They were. You used to have. Yes, the gang system, it worked out. There was a group of people worked together on this job. You were paid each little section of the job. There was a ganger who is in charge, and he did the rota system because we were working extremely long hours when they were in full production. We were working 12 hours a day, and sometimes Saturdays and Sundays too. So one shift would walk out as the other one came in, and you would hand over your jobs to the next group that came in, so it was very busy. But then the ganger would sort out all the work. He'd make sure everything was being supplied and, that you were able to keep going. And he was the one who doled the wages out in the end. And after all this, the girls got half of what the men got for doing exactly the same job. My mate and I couldn't have worked without him, but he couldn't have worked without me either, because he was at one side and I was at the other. But I got on very well, really. I was happy times. Yeah, I'd have times, but they were quite happy times, really. All sorts of tricks they got up to, really. But yes, it was. I can't say that was unhappy. And then I got sent. I got used to living in Coventry, so things improved as I went on, really. The shift we worked were especially there were 12-hour shifts. And when it was extremely busy, that was Saturday and Sunday as well. So you worked the weekends. Because after 1942, the Wellingtons and the Whitleys were not up to the job. The Lancaster was the answer to their prayers. So they were wanting as many. They were losing a lot, but they were wanting as many as they could to replace them. So whilst we were working there, one time you were horrified at the thought of the people that were being lost. Actually, I had a boyfriend who was a bomber pilot, so really I was a bit more involved with bombers than probably the majority of the people that I worked with. And of course, we used to hear the news on the radio. We couldn't hear it because it was noisy. There were air guns, compressed air guns, hammering the rivets in, and the noise was tremendous. So there was no music, nothing like that. But someone would come in and say, we've attacked the Scharnhorst with so forth and so on, the Tirpitz. So many planes are lost. And you used to hold your breath, and then you'd think, everything's all right. And then, of course, one day I went home and the telegram was there at the back of the door. It'd been shot down, so... But anyway, we just carried on. Whilst I was working, as well as when Jim had gone, and it disappeared, I thought, I've got to settle down. It was muck and nettles, wasn't it? So I had to settle down and do something about it. So I joined the tennis club. And then, as I told, I was in St. John's. So a man that I worked with, his wife was the superintendent of the Hospital Saturday Fund brigade in Coventry. So he suggested that I should go and meet his wife, and I did. Now I was accepted into their group. And they used to run the city ambulances at the weekend. During the week, the people that worked on them were paid, but at the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, they were run by voluntary staff. And something else I thought was extraordinarily nice, there was only one paid member of staff, and he was the person that ran the telephones. And he would work without pay because the rest of the people in the department were working without pay. And I thought that ought to be remarked upon, because would this happen today? I doubt it very much. Anyway, I used to go on, my duty roster was 6 o'clock Sunday evening until 7 o'clock Monday morning. So if work allowed, then I would go on duty then. And we did everything that the ambulance does now. We picked up people who were ill. people who had fallen downstairs. One person had hanged himself. Another person had got cut throat. So all kinds of things we attended. And there was just Hospital Saturday Fun, and the city of Coventry also ran an ambulance. But we were young and enthusiastic. And one thing that we had in common was we got to get there before the city. So you can imagine you leapt into the ambulance and off you flew like a bat out of it. And we nearly always got there first. Well, we got there, we beat them. The city ambulance were paid. We were not, but we had the enthusiasm they hadn't got. And of course, there were groups of young people. The people that had been there before had joined the forces, and they used to come back to the station on a Saturday and Sunday. So it was almost like a social club. There was a snooker table and the lads, and of course where there are girls there are boys, and where there are boys there are girls, aren't there? So it was really like a social group, and yes, it was quite a nice break. We worked hard, and we had to take all the exams, and we took it seriously, but actually they had done great work during the Blitz. So they had a very good reputation, that particular group of people. They did. That's where I met my husband, actually. Gradually, the orders were less for the Lancasters. So we were slowing down. Instead of, say, 7 or 8 a week, it was down to 2 or 3, and there was shortages. And so you had a feeling that, I know there was, Japan still hadn't given in, really, and they were planning to make things and moving them over towards Japan, because there was no way that we thought Japan would give in. We knew they would fight on. So there was that in mind, but gradually they were slowing down, and they were not as strict with the work ethic as we had been. And then I can remember when the war finished, and it was VE Day. Now, Jim, that I told you, that was the bomber pilot, he had been taken prisoner of war. He was missing for quite some time, but he'd been taken prisoner of war. And he had been also one of the prisoners that had been turned out of their camp and made to walk 450 miles back into Germany in that dreadful spring when it was so bitterly cold, and a great number of them had died, but nobody knew where they were, and I wasn't quite sure. He hadn't got home. So whilst everybody was celebrating a friend that I'd made, and I went on our cycles, and I always remember that. It didn't come into the city. We went on our bikes and had a ride around this beautiful Warwickshire countryside, and we're just so grateful that it was over. But no, I didn't go into the city. I didn't. The thing that worried me, speaking personally, the thing that worried me most was the losses that we were having with the cargo boats coming, the U-boats, when the U-boats were attacking the merchant navy, because we were able to see film of that on Gaumont British or Pathé News. And you could see these cargo boats being blown out of the water, and the men scrambling in this oily water, getting in a boat if they were lucky, and knowing that they really weren't going to be rescued anyway. And we came to the conclusion that if you were bombed, at least it would be over quickly. But these poor people in the merchant navy were there in the sea, waiting to die, really, without any hope, because the convoy didn't stop to pick them up. They just carried on, and they knew, and we also knew when you were watching this, that was going to be their fate. Very, very few were rescued. So that was the most horrendous, if you're thinking about that. I felt that it was. I went to London just after it'd been bombed, and again, you got this smell. It's a peculiar smell. So it was a dusty, musty smell with a sort of tinge of antiseptic or disinfectant. It was something quite odd about it. But when you walked out, there was this peculiar smell. the stillness. Of course, there was no traffic on the roads. There were no cars on the roads, in spite of what people say about people leaping into the cars and going out into the country. I can assure you there were hardly any cars on the road. All the time I was in St John's working, and that was, 5 or 6 years, I never went to a road traffic accident. I went to people that had run perhaps off the road, odd times, an accident, people falling off their bikes. But there was no petrol available, and they were extremely strict about the petrol. I know some RAF boys pinched it from the aircraft. I know they did. There's all sorts of little reasons, but speaking for the general public. And when I read that people got into their cars, I could yell. I think, what nonsense. The petrol was coloured. And if they could stop you on the road, and if they found that you got pink petrol, you were in serious trouble. And we knew also, like I said, that these boats, those cargo ships were coming from America. We had no oil in Britain. It was all being transported. So you knew that you got something better to do with it than you go jaunting around the roads in cars. No, the cars had to be laid up, and you had to have, they had coupons, and you had to put them at a garage, from that garage, and you had to account for your mileage. I told you about the people in Hinckley. They're girls, of course. It's quite some distance from Coventry. The men were allowed petrol if they filled their car with girls. So you were allowed to have petrol if you were helping the war effort. I know there was black market, I know. But you took a risk. And more than that, really, morally, there was a certain amount of moral attitude to it. You did things, he said, it's not fair, because we realised other people were losing their lives, just to bring things to us. So you were very conscious, especially wasting food. As the news now, I think, you were very, of course the rations were not very much either, but you didn't waste a thing. You didn't.